Hi, everybody. Gene Valentino, and welcome to episode 15 of Gene Valentino's Grassroots Truthcast. So right here in our hangar in Pensacola, Florida, sitting in front of the Icon A5, this is where we do more than just fly a plane. This is where we kibitz with friends and family and guests that come and go, and we talk about things on a social and political level, issues from all walks of life. And we're very fortunate today to have a gentleman who's from the Galilee region of Israel visiting the Panhandle of Florida. He's here to talk at the Temple Beth Shalom Synagogue over in the Fort Walton Beach area. He's here to talk about American and Israeli issues as it relates to Israeli defense and American defense. He's ironically a native of the United States of America, born in New York, and has made his way to Chicago before he took a voyage or a pilgrimage of sorts, as we Christians would call it. It's an aliyah that he engaged in to make his way to his Jewish homeland, Israel. And as a result, he's a dual citizen and has plenty to talk to us about in terms of the security of not only Israel, but America, two of the strongest allies in the world. We'll get into more detail right after this.
With breaking news and political commentary from a public servant, serial entrepreneur, community leader, philanthropist, and American patriot, and a darn nice guy, it's time for the Grassroots Truthcast and your host, Gene Valentino.
Hi, welcome back to Gene Valentino's Grassroots Truthcast, episode number 15 with Elliot Chodoff. Elliot, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Nice to have you here in Gino's hangar. Maybe we'll go up and take a ride and puff a cigar when we're done. I got something here behind me we might want to try out.
Sounds like a plan.
Thank you for coming to the Panhandle of Florida. We have a mutual friend, Jerry Goldstein, who I was privileged to know for over 25 years. He introduced me to you literally a few hours ago,
Yes.
But I heard about you a few weeks ago.
Okay.
Tell me about your background.
Well, I grew up in New York, went to college at Stony Brook on Long Island, went to Chicago, University of Chicago for graduate school, and then I moved to Israel in 1983. I studied a field that pretty much doesn't exist anymore called political and military sociology.
Mm-hmm.
And many of us in that field ended up in political science and international relations strategy, which I taught at the University of Haifa for 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
And along the way, I'm an officer in the IDF, reserve officer now, serving in Northern Command, specializing in strategy, counterterrorism. I live in the Galilee in a very small town that I founded.
You founded?
Yes. 300 families, a long way from New York in many ways.
Uh-huh.
And I see the sunset over the Mediterranean from my house.
Boy.
So it's a beautiful place. And come back to the States periodically to consult, to teach.
When you and I have been speaking for a few hours prior to this broadcast, and one of the things I've learned most about you is your humility and your depth of experience that you've had, not only in the military but in the actual life experiences on the border. And I'd like to pursue that. But before we get started, we have one thing in common. You were speaker, I believe, at the Army War College.
Only briefly. My connection there is that a paper that I wrote that was actually my master's thesis has been on their required reading list.
Oh, well, I might have been doing reading on some of that material because I attended the Army War College under a Associate General Secretary to the Secretary of Defense was Mr. Ferguson. And he sent me to the Army War College for 3-4 days. And I had the privilege of learning just how important it is for the local elected official, I was a county commissioner at the time, to be aware, be in tune with what was going on. Now, in my case here, we have the NAS Pensacola, right. So there's a connection between us.
Yes.
What was the separation of sixes or something? Yeah. We seem to connect. There's always 6 points of separation. Right. Yeah. But continue. I interrupted you.
No, that was basically it. I divide my time now between teaching, consulting, and co-authoring a book now on anti-Semitism. And I'm officially retired, which means I'm working harder than I ever did before.
That's right. Yeah, I thought I was going to take it easy when I retired.
Big
I ended up
mistake.
working twice as hard.
I'd get paid half as much.
You get paid half as much, but I'm retired.
That's right.
We only have one boss now, or maybe two, depending on how you define it.
Yes.
Okay, let me hit to the harder issues, the issues I think of substance. Let's talk about what the Israeli Knesset has just voted on. Benjamin Netanyahu's in the hospital with some medical concerns. He comes out of the hospital on the same day he trots across the street and gets into the Knesset and speaks in favor of the legislative act
Yes.
that talks about the legislative body of government being able to overturn, modify, or revise what you would call your Supreme Court action. What is going on with that issue?
Okay. So to really understand it, you have to go sort of back a step for Americans, because the Israeli system is a democracy, but it's a different form of democracy. And I know Americans have the sense of this one way, our way, and anybody who doesn't do it our way is doing something different.
Well, we have a constitution.
Well, that's one.
Yeah.
You also have in America a presidential rule system as opposed to a parliamentary democracy, which is more common in the European form. The American system has a very, very interesting, the founding fathers of the United States were absolutely brilliant. They were geniuses. And of the many brilliant things that they did was to establish a separation of powers between three branches of government. Now, 3 here is a critical number, because in a three-sided, or what's called a triadic system, you have great stability, because if anybody who tries to change one is opposed by the other two. And everybody wants to keep it at least as good as it is now, and anybody who tries to shift it in their direction is faced with 2-to-1 opposition.
Who's shifting it in which direction?
Well, everybody, and I think the founding fathers understood this here, every branch is trying to gain as much power as they possibly can vis-a-vis the others. But since the others are trying to protect their own interests, that's what keeps the balance. If one of those others doesn't do their job, so for example, if the president tries to aggregate more power into the presidency, and Congress doesn't do its job in balancing it,
Right.
then the presidency will become more powerful.
The pendulum can swing at times based
exactly.
on the character and quality of the elected official,
Exactly.
both in the administrative side, the presidency, versus
and
the legislative side.
Exactly.
But my question to you on that is, I have the impression this reform bill weakens the court, the judicial side of Israel,
Okay, so
at the expense of the judicial side, at the advantage of the legislative side.
yes.
Is this a reaction to, can I say, Mr. Netanyahu's treatment in the last few years?
I don't believe so. Coming to the Israeli system really only has two branches, because Israel's executive, as in a parliamentary system, comes out of the legislature. So the legislature and executive are different but connected in a way that the American system is not. And that's inherently unstable. Now add to that the absence of a constitution.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1990s, the Supreme Court of Israel, under Chief Justice Aaron Barak, shifted power in the direction of the court. In other words, the first real reform in that relationship was a shift of power from the legislature, from the parliament, to the court, which he did through rulings, precedents. That's how you build judicial power, basically. So what's happening today is an attempt to balance against that. Again, that's in the grand sense. About 80% of Israel's population believes that there needs to be judicial reform. And my guess is, and that's a polling fact, I'm going to guess that about 70% are against this reform.
Because
it goes too far. It's not completely thought out in terms of stabilizing the system.
is it
It's a reaction.
Go ahead.
It's a reaction reform as opposed to a constructive
A
reform.
reaction reform to the overzealous attempts to take down President Netanyahu?
Prime Minister. No,
Excuse me, Prime Minister.
a reaction to a judiciary that has aggregated more power to itself than the legislature is comfortable with.
But because you have no constitution, what's the backstop that prevents that overreach?
Okay, so here again, we're in that dynamic. That's the point. And what I would like to see happen is a reform, but a reform that's thought out as a constructive reform rather than a simple power shift back and forth.
By the way, I'm not picking on the Knesset or Netanyahu because I'm leading up to something. Trump versus the Department of Justice versus the FBI.
Yes.
Talk about overreach.
Okay, so here you've got, I think, something of a different case that's similar but different. You have the weaponization of government institutions that should be neutral in their application. Okay, these are executive institutions, but they're not supposed to be political, whether it's the IRS or the Justice Department, the FBI, and law enforcement in general. I don't think I'm sure that's not what's driving what's happening in Israel today. There's certainly in the Likud and around Netanyahu a great deal of frustration with the fact that Netanyahu is being prosecuted on things that are, in some cases, more clearly, again, prosecuted doesn't mean he's going to be convicted, but the case is more clearly one of criminal type, and there are others that are kind
against
of sketchy.
Netanyahu.
Against Netanyahu. Again, I want to be clear. That doesn't mean he did it, but what they're charging him with has corruption built into it.
Do you see a pattern? And
Yeah.
by default, do you see an extended pattern between that and now what you're seeing in the United States? There seems to be a pattern of the abuse of the system to persecute someone, and it's so obvious before an election or...
Okay, so first of all, in Israel, there are no fixed elections. That's another difference between a parliamentary system and the American system. The parliament can dissolve itself and go to elections anytime it wants. And so you can build the 4-year plan, if you will, as you can with the United States.
In your opinion, is that a blessing or a curse?
Both, as in everything else.
Yeah.
It's got its advantages and its disadvantages. Look, the parliamentary system is much more representative than the American system, but it's also less stable in terms of time. All right, the parliamentary system means that you have a multi-party system. You can have a population number of 5%, 6%, 8% that have representatives in the parliament. In the United States, you typically have 49% of the population disenfranchised on a 51-49 split.
Yeah. If you show me how to get 100% of the people on board 100% of the time,
For sure.
I owe you some money.
Business.
We'll go into business on that one.
Exactly. No, but my point is that look, there are local elections or congressional elections, for example, where you can have a 60-40 or even a 70-30 split. But it doesn't matter if you have a 51-49 split, the winner is still the absolute winner. Here.
That's correct.
Okay. In the Israeli system, if you have a 51-49 split, the parliament then gets divided 51-49.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very, very different kind of approach. It makes it much more raucous because you can, if you have 120 seats, which we do, that means that with 0.83% of the vote, you have a seat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's similar in the sense with the United States Congress, though, at least in the House of Representatives, to make the example. Who cares about the merits of the issue these days? As long as the Republicans have the majority or the Democrats have the majority, they're voting in stuff that you and I wouldn't be willing to come home and face our family.
That's right.
But you voted it in because your party voted it in that
Correct.
way. Do you see a parallel between the moral disintegration
Yes.
of ethics and of morality in the legislative process, which precedes the governing?
I have a friend who's a professor of political science at Bar Ilan University in Israel. The tagline on his email says, politics, poly, many, ticks, small crawling blood-sucking creatures. And I think that summarizes what we're talking about here.
That's a good use of the word.
Right. Yes, you vote with the party, which incidentally was not the case historically in America. There was a lot of cross-aisle cooperation and discussion. And I think the polarization, and we have it in Israel as well, is ultimately damaging to democracy.
So you're very expert, obviously, on Israeli government, better than I am, and you certainly know Americans' system as well. My concern is that it's moving towards a direction where the ethics and morals of the majority are not being transcended in the halls of Congress or the Knesset for legislative enactment because of the power, the money, the leverage of a select few controlling the decisions that should reside with the many. And
Yes.
I see that. I didn't see that as much in Israel because I was preoccupied with just how cuckoo things have been in the United States Congress. But when you talk about it, and I see what's happening here, where you have a rogue left group in the Knesset walking out and stopping. Well, they didn't stop it. The election went forward.
Right. The vote went forward.
But it left all those in favor of the reform to obviously win easier by the vote.
Well, they would have won anyway.
They would have won anyway.
Right. There are 120 in the Knesset. They got 64 votes. So 64 was going to beat any.
Then why did they walk out?
To delegitimize it.
And well, what did they do to delegitimize it? There were 500,000 people in riots in the streets.
Here, I can't defend what they did.
No,
I'm telling you what they were thinking. That if we're not there, look, the opposition's motto, if you will, is that this government is leading Israel to dictatorship. It's not. But it's much easier to mobilize a demonstration of support by the tens of thousands if you say we're fighting for democracy against dictatorship than it is if you say, well, we don't like this policy.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, by walking out, they've added to the veneer of it's a dictatorship. Look, the only people who supported this were the other side. And look, it was a 64-0 vote. This is a dictatorship. There was no opposition.
Well, is this, since it seems to be the similar issue in the United States, do you see a pattern where if you're trying to work within a republic or a democrat republic, a constitutional republic for us,
right,
a democracy of some sort for you,
yeah,
where is the thinking that we learned in school about the majority wins and you go on with your life?
Okay, so first of all, that's certainly a problem in both countries.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we're learning from each other those bad habits. Because we do have, you mentioned earlier, Israel and America are allies. We're closer than allies. We're friends at this point.
Yes, sir.
And alliances have a certain formality to them. Our relationship is much more informal than a simple alliance.
You know, go ahead.
And you learn from each other simply
Yeah.
by being around each other and observing each other. And I think this idea of not accepting the outcome of an election is common to both countries today. The underlying, I will say, a priori suspicion that something fishy is going on, and that doesn't mean it's not, but there's a difference between seeing it and saying it and having the a priori assumption that it's going to be. Because you've lost faith. We all know that there are dishonest people out there, but if your attitude is that humanity is dishonest, you see the world in a different way.
Yeah.
And I think that is all corroding our systems.
It's interesting you mention that. I feel what has helped me survive in my life is an optimistic attitude and believing in the best in people and in situations.
Sure.
And I think what you're referring to is what transcended between Israel and America. We believed in the best of each other. Right. I think that was evident when a guy by the name of Donald Trump helped you move our embassy to Jerusalem.
Yes.
And so actions speak louder than words. Sometimes
Absolutely.
in politics, I can see how we allow the angst and anger or personality defects of certain people to dominate our opinion on voting them in or out of office. And in the process, I forget about everything they did that was good.
Yes.
And sometimes everything they did that was bad.
Right.
So do you see it? Do you see the legislative branch somehow peeling back what appears now in the world scene to be an overzealous or an excessive reaction of control against your judiciary?
I see them peeling it back, but I also see that by the way they're doing it, the likelihood that that will be reversed after another election is very high. And I think that
It's high.
Yeah, because there's a 64 majority, which is not very large. And here I am very critical of the Israeli government in its domestic execution, if you will. That rather than trying to organize a broad-based agreement coalition, given that the opposition today, when they were in power, spoke in favor of judicial reform. In other words, this is not something that's exclusively coming from one side against the others. And instead of sitting down with them and saying, look, we all agree there needs to be a reform here. We may not agree on the exact details of it. Let's start with, we agree. Now let's see what we agree on. And let's pass all of that on a broad-based, 80, 90, 100 votes in favor. And that pretty much guarantees into the future that it's not going to be simply overturned.
Do you see a document manifesting itself from the legislative branch that seeks probably a vote of the citizen, which mirrors a constitution or a declaration of independence, which somehow...
Well, we have a declaration.
You have the declaration, but the constitution itself from which the laws and the amendments were added to. In our case, we need to put some more amendments in our Constitution.
Okay, but that's a slow and involved process.
Oh, and deliberative, yes. And it also implies that, boy, you better be serious about making this change. You just don't add amendments to the Constitution willy-nilly.
Right, which is one of the differences that we're talking about, because in Israel, they're simply passing the laws. And laws can be rescinded. The laws can be overturned. It's very, very difficult. Once you put the amendment into the Constitution, it's a long, hard job to either repeal it or
absolutely
overrule it or whatever.
Yeah, it forces us to behave a certain way.
Yes.
The problem here in America is that some of the amendment rules have been overlooked entirely. Free speech, most obviously.
Right.
Gun rights, search and seizure of private information. It's been trampled upon. How does Israel address an overzealous elected official, his staff and bureaucrats, whether it's the citizen or not? How do they go after that same person?
So here, the Israeli system is different from the American one in an additional way.
Oh.
The Israeli Supreme Court actually embodies two different institutions. In other words, the justices of the Israeli Supreme Court simultaneously sit in two different judicial bodies. One is the Supreme Court, which is the highest court of appeals. It's not a constitutional court, but it's an appeals court for cases. But it also has an institution called the High Court of Justice, which in Hebrew, the acronym is Bagatz.
Bagatz.
It's Bet Din Gavoa Letzedek, which is the High Court of Justice.
Okay.
And Bagatz is a direct appeal court for any citizen who feels that they've been wronged by the system. And it can be a direct wronging. In other words, they came after you for something for no reason. It can be a disproportionate kind of an issue. You have some sort of, real estate violation. Everybody else is fined 1,000 shekel, and they fine you 100,000 shekel for the same one. You can go to Bagatz and say, I'm being treated unfairly. And they can rule against the system by just direct rule and force the system to back down off of that. And that's a good thing.
How does it differ from the Supreme Court of our land?
Okay, the U.S. Supreme Court is a constitutional court. The
Yes.
only case that will go before it, even applied, and the Supreme Court doesn't accept most cases, overwhelmingly.
That's correct.
The ones they accept are the ones that have constitutionally interesting factors in them, and only those. In other words, the Supreme Court is not a criminal appeals court.
Right.
where in Israel, the Supreme Court aspect is a criminal appeals court because there's no constitution. The Bagatz is a sort of people's direct appeal against the system. The problem with it is that Bagatz, over the past 30 or so years, has taken for itself the authority to intervene in things that many of us believe are not its jurisdiction or purview. That's right.
So it would be a situation where the individual seeking an appeal, it's not only his appeal, but it would be possibly Bagatz's intervention of.
Yes.
So it's not that we're appealing to the court, it's Bagatz sticking their nose into what other people might say they don't belong to be in.
Because the Bagatz system, under a very activist Supreme Court Chief Justice Aaron Barak in the 1990s, instituted the idea that everything can be brought before the court. You don't need standing. And the vote that was taken this week, the idea of reasonable can be used as a reason for a ruling. In other words, rather than the law, the justices can say this is unreasonable and rule on that basis.
Is this a situation which is what may have caused the left to get so infuriated, minority or majority? Are the left infuriated because they believe that this new rule has overreached in its authority, meaning heavier hand of government, less freedom and liberty of the people?
No, I think they're reacting for a number of different reasons. And basically, when we see those tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of demonstrators in the news, not all of them are there for the same reasons.
Well, that's true here in the States as well.
So you have an anti-Netanyahu crowd, simply because they're on the left. You have another anti-Netanyahu crowd that are personally offended by him, and quite frankly, and I'm not an anti-Netanyahu Israeli, but he's been in for too long.
From America's point of view, if I may,
yes,
he is seen as one of your super leaders that has melded the relationship between the United States and Israel, to your words, what we're very proud of.
Absolutely. And that's why I say I'm not anti. I'm not anti.
Yeah. I'm not anti-Trump, but I probably have the same heartburn.
Okay, right. Enough, right? But look, Netanyahu's been prime minister for over 10 years. And not only I think is that bad, and that's the FDR story right here, which imposed the two-term limit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not about corruption, let's put it that way. Although we know that over time, long-term administration tends toward corruption, and it's not even necessarily profit corruption for the individual, as much as it is political corruption for people in office gaining too much power because of their position, and things like that. He's tired. He lived through 8 years of Obama.
Oh, yeah.
That would tire any Israeli leader out.
Oh, yeah.
And he's ill, clearly. Just had a pacemaker put in. Now, that doesn't mean he's deathly ill, but he's fatigued. And, Patton famously said, fatigue makes cowards of us all.
Yeah.
And I think that what we're seeing now is that he's making less good decisions, which is natural under the circumstances. So there are people who are opposing him on that basis. There are people who are opposing the particulars of this reform, or to put it in other words, and I fall not heavily into this category, but into the category, I believe we need reform, but not this one.
Okay, let's take a minute here. We're talking with Elliot Chodoff. Elliot is a political and military analyst, and he's been specializing in the Middle East conflict, the global war on terrorism. He's in the panhandle of Florida, speaking before a local synagogue temple in the Fort Walton Beach area. And we're very honored to have him through some mutual friends here in the panhandle of Florida. This is episode number 15 of Grassroots Truthcast with Elliot Chodoff, who's also a dual citizen. He's learned as much about America and American governance as he has Israelized himself in the nation of Israel. And his stories run a little deeper. We're going to get into some deeper questions with Elliot right after this message, so stay with us.
Gene Valentino's Grassroots podcast. He tells the truth. He tries to get information out there to make sure people make good, informed decisions.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the second half of our episode 15 with Elliot Chodoff. He's an American citizen, but he's also an Israeli citizen with over 35 years of military experience. Elliot has been first served in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, for nearly 35 years now, and he was the co-director of the Fieldcraft Project in the Office of Chief of Doctrine, Infantry, and Paratroopers. He co-authored the Fieldcraft Manual and taught courses in fieldcraft and tactics to the infantry and special forces and special force officers. He served time in Gaza, Judea, Samaria, and participated in the Second Lebanon War. Oh boy, I could go on. You were also a strategic and military analyst, and he's advised the military on several matters involving law enforcement and the government leaders in an ongoing basis on the war of terrorism. Speaking of the war on terrorism, welcome again to our show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Speaking of the war on terrorism, sir.
Yes.
Is Iran our friend or what?
Well, when they say death to America,
Should be pretty obvious.
It should. I mean, my friends don't say death to Elliott. They might, but they don't say that. No,
not the friends,
not
anyway.
the friends. Anyway. No, Iran is an outspoken, aggressive, vehement enemy of the United States of America.
How and why did we allow ourselves to get so far compromised? I remember back in the days of Obama, pallet loads of hundreds of millions of dollars
Yes.
of cash being dropped off on the runway in Iran. Yes. And then subsequent retreat from the Trump strong nuclear policy. We almost had them out of business at one point with the help of Israel. What happened?
I think it starts with a fundamental human problem. It's very difficult, and I say this as a Jew and as an Israeli, and as an American. It's very difficult to fully comprehend that people hate you for what you are as opposed to for what you've done. Because if they hate you for what you are, then there's nothing you can do about it. If they hate you for what you've done, you can apologize. Yeah. It may work, it may not, but you can change your behavior. And Iran hates America and Israel. And by the way, it hates America even more than it hates Israel for what it is. Western liberal democracy is anathema to Iran. And we know this because Ayatollah Khomeini wrote about it. By the way, it's stuff that's been translated into English, and I've read it.
I'm aware of that. Why do we ignore that? Why do we not realize what is the American benefit, Israel or no Israel now? What is America's benefit to have abrogated all of our position of strength over them?
Well, if you believe that if we're only nice to these people and have a cup of coffee with them, we'll bring them around, then that's the reasoning.
Over my dead body, that would never happen.
I agree with you, but there are people who really believe that. And if we're nice to them and we give them a bunch of money, because after all, that's all they're really interested in, then they'll come around, they'll be nice to us, and that's the end of it. The fact is that it makes no difference whatsoever what America does. Iran wants to destroy America.
When we gave money to Israel to help with incentives, whether it was technology-based or military-based, there was always a clear path of understanding. I felt that the money was always going in a good direction.
Sure.
When we gave money to Afghanistan and to Ukraine and a few other parts of the world, I'm looking for business terminology, ROI. I'm looking for the return on investment.
Sure.
And I don't see a proportionate return.
With Iran?
Well, in this case, Iran most obviously,
Zero.
but zero. But now it's becoming almost in the same light. You've got a rich Biden family that's coming up with money for mansions of homes that I don't know how you afford on that, no matter how good that salary is.
Right.
And I don't understand how we could be so aggressive in supporting Ukraine without a more careful understanding of what we were giving them the money for, which is what distinguishes Israel from an ally, if they are one, an ally like Ukraine,
Okay. So
or NATO in general. I don't see any of them stepping up in the way that America did with Israel, Israel did with America. What's going on with Iran, and why would they not want to participate in a positive, constructive, economic development-based alliance with America?
Okay, so first of all, fundamentally, Iran is a radical Islamic regime. And what we know from the history of radical Islam, I'm talking about 20th century political Islam that came out of the Muslim Brotherhood. Khomeini was a disciple of the ideology of the Brotherhood. So it goes directly to there. As I said before, they hate America because America is the antithesis of what they believe the world should be. And it's not about Islam versus, let's say, Christian or Jewish. That's a component. It's a method of government, a method of rule that is simply at loggerheads with Western liberal democracy as we understand it. The ideologue of the Brotherhood, a guy named Said Qutb, came to America in the late 1940s, and he was horrified. Women can walk on the street unescorted? How can you possibly run a society this way? So it's hard for us to understand because we come from a kind of live and let live type of an attitude, and they don't. So it starts there. But now let's go up a level. Iran, Russia, China have something in common. It's not base ideology, but each of them is an imperial wannabe. Right? Putin wants to rebuild the Soviet, sphere. China, well, is China. And Khomeini said outright, they want to rebuild the Persian Empire.
Yeah.
And for those who are not familiar with what that means, open up the book of Esther and read the first verse. The Persian Empire was 127 provinces, India to Ethiopia. Okay, it was a global, for its day, a global empire. And in all three cases, the team to beat is the United States of America.
Which now includes Israel.
Well, Israel certainly is part of that sort of sphere. Yeah. Israel has the additional two disadvantages of being Jewish and being in their neighborhood.
Yeah,
so
you're in the backyard.
So we're right there, exactly. And we are a problem for the Iranians in their direction. We're a problem for the Russians. Because the Russians, this is maybe a tangential topic, but Putin went into Ukraine in order to bolster his position in Crimea because of his naval base in Sevastopol, because he wants to challenge the United States in the Eastern Mediterranean. We are a thwart to that challenge. If America doesn't have Israel sitting in the Eastern Mediterranean, then it is in a much weaker position. So everything's connected.
It's this. Is it that the world has awakened, the enemy has awakened to an alternative plan? Instead of trying to build the nuclear bomb, to go after America, ergo Israel. Might that not be the diversion or the deflection of your attention? Might not the real assault on us be from within? For example, the escape of some 40-something people, the liberal element of the Knesset that walked out on the vote recently, and here in the United States Congress, we've got some whack jobs that I can't figure out how to get into office, that got into office, but they did. And my question is, China's philosophy always to me was, let's eat the monster from within, the Trojan horse,
Right.
the Manchurian candidates.
The Russians have used the same thing.
And as a consequence, what is our defense mechanism for that if it's from within? If you go to a Supreme Court, whether in Israel or in the United States, that's been polluted by the likes of a George Soros and been able to form itself over the course of decades, a half a century, is an initiative that they certainly exercised patience over, but it left not only the military hamstrung with ding-dongs at different ranks of the military, but it also obviously is an embarrassment on the 6 o'clock news, whether it's the president tripping or some idiot in Congress embarrassing America. How do you fix it from within?
Okay. So first of all, I don't think that the external influence is as great as you're making it out to be. It's there. Let's not misunderstand.
Well, they did say Russian collusion was a false narrative,
Right,
so your
okay.
point is made.
However, it's there. And it's there on a number of different levels, including in social media, all sorts of trolling. It doesn't take a lot to put ideas into people's heads. But I think that what we're seeing is an extreme case of the sloppiness of democracy, and it is. And that's part of it. And if you want order, go fascist. Right?
Yeah. Well, let's see how long that lasts.
Right. And you wouldn't be happy
Yeah,
with that.
right.
No, I wouldn't. And I'm a firm believer in Western liberal democracy. As you put it, it's the worst of all systems except for all the rest.
Right. Yeah, there's a Mark Twain comment like that too, I think. Go ahead.
So it is sloppy. And as sloppy, it's uncomfortable, and it's got its shifts. That doesn't disturb me. It may aggravate me on the immediate basis. I think that the real danger from within, I think, is ignorance. And I think I see this today more in the United States than I do in Israel, in part because of very, very limited military service. I know, and I've been speaking in the U.S. over the years on subjects of military and security issues. And I know that my audiences 30 years ago were still heavily populated with World War II veterans, Vietnam veterans, who got it. They understood. They didn't necessarily know what I was telling them. They learned it from me, but they got it. I get up in front of audiences today, and they have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Because you have an extremely limited service.
Yeah.
And that means the media can tell you nonsense, which it does. And that doesn't happen in Israel. You can't pull that same nonsense in a population of universal conscription.
That's interesting, and I think that's a point of distinction between Israel and the United States. You're more circumspect, and your structure of your operation is set up so to vet the insurrection or the infiltration of a wrongdoer. Here, they seem to not only walk over a border, but I remind folks, let's talk about something that's really different between the United States and Israel. How about a border? Is your border managed differently than our southern border? Tell me how your border's managed.
First of all, our borders are all military borders. We don't have any friends on our borders, not even make-believe.
Just talk about the nature and character of these borders in Israel.
Our northern border is populated by Hezbollah, which is a direct arm of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards of Iran. Our northeastern border is Syria, Also with enemies, you can't count them fast enough. The Jordanian border, we're at peace with Jordan, but Jordan is a very weak country with all sorts of security issues. And our other border is with Egypt, and here again, we're at peace with Egypt, but the Sinai is swarming with terrorists. So all of our borders are closed. Now, there are crossings.
And protected.
Well, when I say closed, I mean not just fenced. It's a fenced system with military units on combat alert, not police.
Without compromising security, can you talk to the nature of the technology of just how sophisticated it is?
Okay. So the technology is there. First of all, full disclosure, I am devoutly low tech.
Okay.
Okay. I still navigate with the sun, the moon, and the stars. They don't fail.
We're in the same camp.
Okay. GPS and I have a hate-hate relationship.
Yeah. I got a plane behind me with GPS, and I want to whack it once in a while.
Okay. It always tells me to turn into the water, and I don't quite understand.
Yeah,
Right.
I'm heading the wrong direction. I'm saying this is technology.
That's right. Okay. So having said that, technology has value, certainly does. And we have sensors, and the fences are electronic, not electric. In other words, if you touch it, it doesn't zap you, but it sets off alarms in places where they need to be. But the bottom line is that it's backed, and I think this is an important point for the American border. Technology is not the solution. Technology provides the solution, which is manpower, personnel, with a better way of doing it. If you don't have, it can be police, it can be border police, it can be troops, it doesn't matter. If you don't have people watching it, then it's a waste of time. And I will tell you from my experience, and it hasn't changed, there has not yet been designed the technology that will stop a determined human being.
Which leads to a question I was going to ask anyway. So we're good allies. We're friends. We're brothers, and we're worried and watching each other's back.
Yes.
In the early days, you mentioned at the start of benevolence, we didn't need NATO. We had the Berlin airlift. We had the Marshall Plan. We had other things we did as a nation. We didn't need NATO. We were doing it on our own anyway. We were being generous Americans to the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
It wasn't a matter of jamming democracy down your throat.
No.
In fact, to the contrary, we were trying to help certain regimes survive that we necessarily didn't agree with completely.
Right.
But that was our policy going back even before Reagan. But when Reagan came in, he helped with that Iron Dome you now have.
Yes.
Which helps protect all the hostile neighbors around your border. And so this is what drives to the distinction between America and Israel. You don't tolerate wrongdoing, you keep them out. We, in our benevolence, I think have been lulled into a sense of euphoria and comfort that it's okay to care for them. If I want to protect my family and I see a hostile element coming in over the border, who do you think I'm worrying about first? Why, from Israeli intelligence point of view, has our brother in Israel not grabbed some of these ding-dongs, some of them claiming to be Jewish and of a Jewish descent? Why haven't we headlocked some of them and kicked their butts into straightening out their extreme misguided benevolence?
I think there's one screaming fundamental difference between the Israeli situation and the American one.
Tell me.
You're here in America are very fortunate. This is an enormous country with, and I'm not understating the case, with two very secure borders by my standards. And your other two borders are called the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans.
Yes.
So the sense of threat is not palpable. Now,
we seem more isolated, you mean, or separated.
It's just 9/11 was an exception.
Yes.
Okay, but that was easily forgotten, which it has been. The last time there was a war on the American continent was the American Civil War. It's a long time ago.
Yeah.
Throw in the attack on Pearl Harbor, 9/11, you've got an occasional, and I'm not belittling any of these,
Oh,
right?
I understand your point.
But the impact is low, and even in World War II, aside from the California scare of a Japanese invasion, which was pure paranoia, the Japanese weren't invading California.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it sure did cause everybody to get on their game.
Okay, so there was a bit of a panic. Pearl Harbor did that. There were the German U-boats off the Atlantic coast. So it was there, but America fought its war on the other side of the oceans. Fast forward, Korea, same story. Vietnam, same story. Iraq, Afghanistan, same story. Now, I'm not belittling any of those, and I don't want to get into the details of them, but I'll tell you one huge difference. In my office in the Army, in Northern Command, I have a floor-to-ceiling, wall-to-wall map. And for those who are familiar with maps, it's a 1 to 50,000 topographical map,
Oh, my.
which means that this is a kilometer.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? It's pretty
Big.
And without exaggerating, my map has something on it that no tactical map in the US military has. Up over here is Damascus, the capital of Syria. And up over here is Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. And over here is my house. I'm not exaggerating. There's a dot on my map. That's my house. And all of my enemies are here, my immediate ones, on the map. So when something happens and a mark goes up on the map, I don't have to measure it. I know exactly how far that is from my house. And it's measured in miles in 2 digits.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of changes your perspective on things.
Yeah.
Your understanding of threat. I think we all human beings, have a tendency of denial, right? It's not that dangerous. It doesn't really mean me. I can get around. I have no such misperceptions. It's right there.
Look what the Jews went through during World War II.
Absolutely.
How they're trying to, some crazy extremists now trying to suggest Hitler wasn't a problem.
That's right.
And they're making light of his presence.
That's right.
I mean, that couldn't be more wrong.
Sure.
And so I'm ready to ask you on a global sense about the threat of a George Soros impacting the political, social environment here in the States and third-party issues. You're looking at a map where on the same map, you've got the threat in your eye, in front of you.
That's right. And
so obviously, as close as we are as allies, we have a distinction.
Yes.
We have a difference.
America's threat timeline, with the exception of Russian today, Soviet then, intercontinental ballistic missiles or submarine-launched missiles, where you have a 20-minute or so response time. Everything else, I don't know, I'm sure you remember when Hillary was running against Obama in the primaries, there was that ad, who would you want to be on the other end of the phone to be awakened in the middle of the night?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So let me let you in on a little secret here.
Yes, sir.
There is no threat in the world, with the exception of ballistic missiles coming in, and then it doesn't matter, there's nothing you can do about
Right.
it. There's no threat in the world that requires waking the American president in the middle of the night. Because whatever it is, it's still going to be there 4 or 5 hours later after the president has a cup of coffee and comes and sits down in the situation.
Including a nuclear bomb?
I said with the exception of
with
the
the
nuclear.
exception.
Okay? But whatever else, revolutions, wars breaking out, 4 hours from now, there are already procedures that are going to kick in almost automatically in terms of preparation. Decisions don't have to be made on that level of speed. In Israel, 4 hours, the country can be gone.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a whole different mindset that we see our timetable as right now has to happen. And America says, you know what, get back to me in a week.
Yeah.
And I don't say that critically.
I know exactly what you
I mean it
Let's
analytically.
America has made its own intelligence decision and probably knew the immediacy of that threat.
Yes. And you know what? Let's use World War II as the example. Pearl Harbor happened. It still took America 6 months to get into the war. Because it takes that long,
Yeah.
right? Yamamoto,
Gearing up.
We've awakened the sleeping giant. You know, it takes the sleeping giant months to get out of bed.
Well, speaking of that, we have awakened the sleeping giant, I believe, not only on this show, but I think America at large has finally awakened, hopefully not awokened, but let's hope they've awakened to the truth about just how silly some of these perverse extreme positions have become. Folks, we're talking with Elliot Chodoff. He's 35 years with the Israeli Defense Forces. He's coming to us from some dear friends here in the Panhandle. He'll be speaking at a local synagogue later today on matters of Israel and American military defense issues. I'm very fortunate to have him with us today on Gene Valentino's Grassroots Truthcast. This is episode number 15. Before we go, you're ambassador from Israel. I'm ambassador from the United States.
Yes.
And we're swapping notes with each other, and I think it would be pretty easy for us to be pretty damn good friends.
Yes.
You hit me up for a request. What would you suggest Israel, the United States, do to help Israel if you could have it perfectly your way?
Two things. One is have our back. And two, provide that having our back with the wherewithal for us to do it. And I'll break it down in this sort of way. You've never requested American troops. The only time American troops served operationally in Israel was during the Gulf War with Patriot anti-missile batteries, and that was part of an American program to keep us from retaliating against Saddam Hussein because he was firing Scud missiles at our cities. Defense? No, sir. We'll do it ourselves, thank you very much.
You've always done that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Equipment. There's a great story that's told. Golda Meir and Richard Nixon had a very good relationship.
Yes.
And they both had a sense of humor. And the story is that Nixon turned to Golda one day and said, if you could have 3 wishes from America, what would you wish for?
I didn't know he asked that, by the way.
Yes, he did, okay. And she, without batting an eye, turned to him and said, I would take 3 of your generals. And he said, our generals? Your generals are the best in the world. Which of ours could you possibly want? She said, General Motors, General Dynamics, and General Electric. Because those are the generals that Israel doesn't have.
See, that's the discipline that we have here, is an economic-based discipline.
Absolutely.
And a lot of America's success, right or wrong, took greedy people to put their anger aside because they wanted to make money instead. And I don't care whether he's Jew or Arab, I'm going to get along with him because I can make $1 million
right.
off of that deal.
Right.
And the opposite's true. I have 3 requests of you. So I turn to my Israeli ambassador here, and as an American ambassador, I say to you, my request would be that while we are strong with the 3 generals, Electric, Dynamics, and the other one, we are General Motors, we are weak in our disciplines of military strength in terms of ethics and intestinal fortitude. We have lost the passion and the fiber within us to be a strong nation. I fear that. And I want the nation that has worked harder than hell to defend themselves with no one's help, in effect, doing it alone at times, to come over and teach a bureaucrat, teach an elected official, and teach some of these military leaders who think they're military leaders a thing or two. That would be my request. The Israeli culture of discipline that you use to manage your affairs so effectively while we trip and fall over our shoelaces. And it's getting worse because we've gotten more lax. Even the retired military officers are shaking their heads saying, God, I'm glad I'm out. Well, God, I'm glad I wish they'd speak up and reach out to a guy like you to help train the guys here about the shortcomings and lack of discipline, which is now transcended into the school system. And that's where we need help. Tell me about your school system. Everyone's got to go right through to college, right? Or they go
No,
into,
after 12th grade, you go into the military.
that's what I meant. You get transitioned into a
Right.
mandate for the military.
Yes, we have what I call an unselective service system.
And ours is very selective, volunteer.
Everybody is eligible. In other words, everybody must go through the recruitment induction process. They may be exempted, but it's not a come to us if you get called. It's come to us based on your birthday, and we'll decide whether we continue the process with you or not.
Well, a government-controlled mandate to go in and serve for 2 to 4 years is definitely something we should emulate, should copy what you're doing.
I agree. I don't
And I think that would solve some of the discipline issues too.
I don't think it's a coincidence that the greatest period in American history was the period after World War II, when over 10 million Americans were discharged, came home, and the economy exploded in the positive sense. Because these people, you know what, after going ashore at Omaha Beach or Tarawa or whatever, your view of the world is very different, and your sense of what you can accomplish is very different. Your discipline is different.
Yeah, and these Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z folks, our children and grandchildren, they haven't had that experience. No. I regret that it took a war for them to get over there.
I'm not advocating war.
Look what happened just with the Jews. But so I regret that. But is the good side, is the positive consequence of that the experiences our grandfathers had that now transcended at least one generation to my father and to me? It's my children and grandchildren I'm worried about.
So that's why I'm saying
they're naive. They're in a bubble.
War certainly is not a good thing, and I don't want to sound like I was advocating. But military service alone, without war, serving, the discipline that's involved, the knowing that you're part of a system, there are people above you and below you. If it's done correctly, the mission orientation. We have a saying in the reserves in Hebrew, we operate by a system that is finish and go home. Okay, in other words, how long are you in for? Until I accomplish my mission. And that carries also into civilian mindset of, you don't live 9 to 5. And there are people who do, but the successful types understand, you know what, if I got to stay up till 2 in the morning to get this done, I stay up till 2 in the morning to get it done.
Wow. We are really enjoying ourselves today with Elliot Chodoff. He had 35 years with the Israeli Defense Forces, a much deeper background in teaching and administration and education of others in the defenses of his nation, Israel. A native born in America and then became dual citizen in Israel, with Israel. Elliot, we're about to wrap up. Any final thoughts for the folks? If you could just...
Yeah, I'll add one final point, sort of as
please,
an appendix to your question. One of the most, if not the most important additional answer to what America can do for Israel. A strong America is a necessity for Israel. And a weak America is a danger for Israel.
That's scary.
Yes, it is.
And that I hope you take that to heart. It should cause all of you to realize that it's not someone else's problem. It's your problem and mine. We as citizens in the United States each have a voice and an obligation to make sure we elect the right candidates, vote for the right candidates, and putting the right person into office. We're sometimes swayed by hyperbole and accusations that are falsely based. What have you done for me lately is what some of them say. It's what you've done for me before that is the precedent about what I expect you to do for me in the future. And I would ask you to consider your vote for your next candidate, with your next candidate, the elected candidates, the candidates running. Consider your vote carefully and make sure your vote goes towards a person, whether it's state and local or nationally, make sure it's going toward a person that believes in the future protection of America. After all, Why do we have so many people piling into our borders? It's not because they hate the place. It's because it's got something that they don't have. We better learn to respect that and protect it. Ambassador Elliot Chodoff.
Thanks for the promotion.
You might as well be an ambassador. You and I would get along great, Jeff. Why don't we call our respective officials and put a word in for each other?
Absolutely.
This has been a great show. Elliot Chodoff from Israel and the United States been with us here on episode 15 of Gene Valentino's Grassroots Truthcast. We'll have more episodes coming up in the future. If you haven't, please subscribe so that we can email and push this episode out to you every week when we do one. Or you're welcome to surf through our website at genevalentino.com. But it's so much easier if you just subscribe, then we can push the episode to you. You can see it in your inbox every week. We really enjoyed having you with us today. This has been a great episode with Elliot Chodoff. Thanks for joining us. See you again soon.
Thanks for joining us for Gene Valentino's Grassroots Truthcast. Be sure to like and subscribe, and God bless America.